Welcome to a fact-first deep dive. One defeat on a ridgeline lodge, Trail Ridge, did more than shock a frontier post. It realigned costs, slowed the emigrant stream, and opened a path to a treaty that closed the corridor. We will stay with the documents, dispatches, returns, and winter counts to track what happened and what did not. No myths, only what the record can bear. Before we begin, share one word for how the phrase Lodge Trail Ridge makes you feel curious, skeptical, somber. Then stay through the turning point to see how a local action cascaded into national policy. In the high grasslands between the Bighorn Mountains and the Yellowstone waters, the fate of a single road would decide who held the open country. In the mid-1860s, the Powder River country became a test of power, measured not in walls, but in movement over grass and snow. The dates and places are exact. From 1866 through 1868, along the Bozeman Trail between Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, United States garrisons tried to keep a corridor open to the Montana goldfields. Across the same ground, the Lakota, often called Sioux, together with Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho, moved camp scouts and war parties to hold hunting country intact. Councils gathered on the Tongue and the Rosebud, and along the Powder, while soldiers cut timber and hay within sight of their walls. The principal actors are clear. Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota stood within a coalition of Lakota divisions, including Oglala Miniconjou and Hunkpapa, with allies among the Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho. Opposite them, Colonel Henry Carrington and a shifting roster of officers led mixed companies posted at the three forts. Travelers, contractors, and families became part of the contest, as the road drew people into narrow valleys and broken ridges. The central question is direct. What combination of Ames logistics, weapons ground, and diplomacy allowed the Lakota and their allies to impose costs that the forts could not bear and to force the closure of the road by treaty? The significance reaches beyond a single campaign. The Powder River story shows how control in open country can rest with those who choose when to fight and when to fade, and who can keep non-combatants shielded while striking at exposed details. It also marks one of the rare moments when a line of posts fell silent because the landscape itself favored those who knew it best. In the years before the first stockade went up on the Bozeman Road, the causes gathered in a steady line. In 1851, at Fort Laramie, United States commissioners drew broad zones of use for many nations across the northern plains. The lines on paper did not match the living range of the buffalo or the seasonal reach of Oglala Miniconjou and Hunkpapa camps, nor did they bind gold seekers who would come later. In 1862 and 1863, strikes in the Montana fields sent a stream of travelers north from the Platte across Powder River valleys toward the Yellowstone country. Guides like John Bozeman marked cutoffs that saved time, but crossed the best grass and water that fed Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people. By 1864 and 1865, mixed survey and emigrant columns tested the route with skirmishes and burned wagons along the way. Every passage taught the same lesson. A guarded road would require fixed posts, timber hay, and patrols, all inside a landscape that gave fast riders the choice of time and ground. Federal policy after the Civil War favored speed to the mines and a show of authority along the overland paths. In early 1866, orders from the War Department authorized a line of forts to protect the corridor. Colonel Henry Carrington led infantry north to raise Fort Reno on the Powder River, then Fort Phil Kearny under the shadow of the Bighorn Front, and finally Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn River. The construction itself became a signal. Wood trains and hay parties moved out daily. The ring of axes in the pinery and the stacked hay fields told every scout that the garrisons were thin and tethered to routine. At the same time, peace commissioners spoke of a new treaty that might settle boundaries and traffic. Yet the work of building forts continued without waiting for a diplomatic end. For the Lakota and their allies, the deep cause was food security joined to sovereignty. The Powder River country was the core of the hunt. It linked summer high grass to sheltered wintering places, and it carried the herds between the Tongue, the Rosebud, and the Powder. A permanent wagon road with civilian trains and army escorts would split that round and drain game. The councils held on the Rosebud and along the Powder in the spring and summer of 1866 set a clear objective. Deny the road, wear down the details that left the walls, control when and where to fight, keep non-combatants screened in river bottoms while mounted parties drew soldiers into broken ridges. United States objectives were equally plain: open and keep the shortest path to Montana, demonstrate federal reach after a civil war, protect civilian movement with static posts and flying columns. Yet constraints pressed from the first week. Infantry companies marched on foot across long distances. Draft animals needed forage through early snows. Ammunition and rations moved by wagon over bad grades. Telegraph support ended far to the south. Every escort stretched the line of help. A storm or a false chase could leave a detachment beyond sight of the flagpole, with no fast reserve to close the gap. Policy and administration shifted while the corridor bled resources. Responsibility sat with the army in the field, even as diplomats gathered language for a treaty. Agency officials who would later count annuities and keep rolls were not yet in a position to shape daily movement on the road. Winter intensified every decision. The hunger of livestock inside the posts, the cold that slowed sentries and dulled sentry routines, the snow that hid decoys and covered tracks, all favored the side that did not have to guard a fixed place. By late autumn of 1866, repeated wood road alarms and small fights hardened habits on both sides. Pursuit from Fort Phil Kearny grew quick and aggressive. Decoy parties grew bolder and more precise in how they showed themselves and then vanished over the skyline. Immediate triggers stacked up. There were arrests and reprisals along the emigrant stream in prior seasons. There were rumors of disarmament in talks far to the south that stiffened resolve in the north. Most of all, there was the simple daily fact that soldiers had to cut timber and hay in set places. Each detail created a meeting point. Each meeting point created a test of discipline and distance. The march beyond supporting range over Lodge Trail Ridge in December set catastrophe in motion, but it was only the most visible outcome of a structure already built by orders, by geography, and by need. By the opening of 1867, both sides refined logistics. The Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho drew camps nearer to the center of gravity and set runners across the valleys to call fighters when columns left the posts. They carried powder and ball with economy and relied on horse and local forage. The United States replaced many muzzle loaders with breech-loading rifles and tightened escort drills. Yet the road itself remained the weakness. It demanded presence in too many places at once. The causes were now fused. A gold corridor met a hunting ground. A fort line met a mobile coalition. The buildup was complete, and the fights that followed would be decided less by single weapons than by who could set terms on an open map. In early winter 1866, the pattern that would decide the corridor revealed itself on the wood road northwest of Fort Phil Kearny. The Oglala Lakota with Northern Cheyenne scouts watched the daily rhythm of the pinery details. Wagons creaked out at dawn, axes rang by mid-morning. Escorts bunched near the teams, while mounted lookouts ranged too far to support them. Snow lay in drifts along the draws, and the wind lifted powder off the sage. Decoy riders showed and vanished at the right edge of vision. When the escort pursued at a trot, the decoys slid over low ridges toward ground cut with coulees. More riders rose from cover in lines that curved around the flanks and pressed the wagons back on the narrow track. Signals moved by motion, not wire. Inside the fort, a bugle and a blur of runners carried word to the parade ground. Relief parties marched, but distance and relief time grew long in the cold. By noon, the timber train had formed a ring and repelled rushes and close smoke. The return to the fort at dusk carried bodies and stories. The incident taught both sides that routine work beyond the walls could be shaped by those who chose the place. It also taught the garrison that speed without depth could snap when the road bent behind a ridge. 2 weeks later, the same ground produced a sharper test. On 6 December 1866, an Oglala decoy party led mounted soldiers and infantry toward Lodge Trail Ridge while the main body of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne fighters waited beyond the skyline. The winter light was short and the air was brittle. Couriers inside the fort had to cross wind-carved swales to pass orders. The interpreter force was small and messages were few. A relief column started late and met skirmishers filtering back through the cuts in the ridge. The fight ended with the wagons and the escort battered, but together. Within the post, the effect was paradoxical. Confidence rose in small successes under pressure, while the habit of quick pursuit hardened. The wood road and the ridge became a field school in the methods of decoy and envelopment. On 21 December 1866, the spiral tightened. Captain William Fetterman marched from Fort Phil Kearny with a mixed detachment of infantry and cavalry in response to another alarm from the wood road. The air was clear and cutting. The snow carried tracks like writing. As the column climbed Lodge Trail Ridge, the decoys widened their gap and beckoned over higher ground where gullies and knobs cut sightlines to the fort. The Lakota and Northern Cheyenne main body closed from 3 directions with speed that came from riders who knew every fold of the slope. A reserve of warriors held the escape lanes. The fight lasted minutes once the circle closed. No man from the main body returned. Inside the post, the telegraph key sat silent because there was no wire to the outside world. A courier rode south with the news. The nearest line that could carry a dispatch to Washington was far down the Platte. The gap between event and report took days, and the gap between shock and policy took months. In the meantime, patrols shortened their leash. Wood and hay details were doubled in strength, yet rarely ventured far. The countryside belonged to the riders who set the meeting points. Carrington Official Report. Fort Phil Kearny, Wyoming Territory, 1866-12-26. We count the loss of 3 officers and 76 men, with 2 civilians and not a survivor from the field. The nature of the ground and the rapid concentration of the enemy forbade relief in time. Through the late winter and spring of 1867, the Allied camps shifted along the Tongue and the Rosebud. Oglala and Miniconjou headmen met with Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho to plan the summer. Runners moved through willowed bottoms to call fighting men when signals rose near the forts. The United States replaced many muzzle-loading rifles with breech-loading conversions and drilled to fight from hasty cover. Yet the road still demanded exposed labor. Hay had to be cut in open bottoms along the rivers. Timber had to be felled in the pinery north of Fort Phil Kearny. Every day of work drew a line on the map that the coalition could test. On the first day of August 1867, the test came near Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn. A hay party of soldiers and civilian teamsters worked inside a log corral set in a flat meadow with the river beyond. The sky was hard blue, and the heat wavered above the grass. Northern Cheyenne and Lakota fighters massed on the low rises and rushed the corral in waves. The defenders fired from trenches and from behind the log lattice. Breech-loading rifles kept a steady rate and cut down the time when men were exposed in the act of reloading. Couriers from the post crossed open ground under fire with canteens and cartridges. An interpreter shouted ranges. The attack bled strength through midday and rolled off with the sun. The immediate effect was this. A small position with timber walls and new rifles could hold for hours against far larger numbers if water and ammunition lasted and if relief was within reach. The larger fact remained. The hay did not move free to the post. It moved under siege. At dawn on 2 August near Fort Phil Kearny, the pattern repeated with a different kind of cover. A wood detail sheltered behind strong wagon boxes set in a ring on a knoll above the creek. The air carried smoke from green pine cut the day before. Lakota Oglala, Miniconjou, and Hunkpapa societies, with Northern Cheyenne allies, rode in lines and circled in dust. Charges broke against a band of men who could fire prone behind chest-high boards and reload fast. Officers counted cartridges and passed canteens. Runners to the fort churned the track. By late morning, a single mountain howitzer on the skyline signaled that relief was coming. The wave rhythm of attack and pause flattened, and the mounted parties turned away. Casualty estimates on the attacking side would grow in later decades as folklorists and pride embroidered the count. What the day fixed beyond dispute was the tactical value of cover and breech loaders for small defensive parties, and the strategic fact that even with such tools, the post did not regain the country beyond their walls. Signals and delays framed every one of these incidents. In the corridor, there was no continuous telegraph to warn the next post. News rode on horses or moved by rumor along emigrant strings. Interpreters stood between languages and tried to compress complex aims into short lines during parley or alarm. Weather imposed its own code. Snow made every hoofprint bright but froze fingers on triggers. Summer heat dried the creeks that teams needed and lifted dust that gave away movement at miles. The immediate effects stacked up in the same direction. Civilians clustered behind stockades. Freight strings waited for larger escorts. Small garrisons lost men on the slopes and learned to count distance with a heavy caution. The coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho deepened confidence and tightened coordination between decoy bands and enveloping wings. By the close of the season, the road was open only in theory. The reality on the ground was a line of forts that could survive when braced inside timber or behind boxes, yet could not impose safe passage across the open country that fed the people who opposed it. The campaign opened as a line on a map and hardened into a season of motion. In early summer 1866, the United States marched north from the Platte to raise 3 posts on the Bozeman Road. Fort Reno held the Powder Crossing. Fort Phil Kearny sat between Clear Creek and the Little Piney under the long wall of the Bighorn front. Fort C.F. Smith rose on the Bighorn River to cover the upper reach. The garrisons were a mix of infantry companies with a few light pieces and small cavalry detachments for scouting. Their tasks were to secure daily wood and hay details to escort contractors and to answer alarms with speed. Against them stood a coalition of Oglala Lakota with Miniconjou and Hunkpapa divisions and allies among the Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho. Their order of battle did not stand in ranks. It gathered through councils and split into decoy parties, blocking wings and enveloping groups that could assemble at the sound of a shot and vanish at dusk. The march that mattered was not a single column, but a repeated trail between Fort Gate and work site. From Fort Phil Kearny, parties moved before sunrise to the Pinery northwest and to the grass bottoms east of the post. The route crossed small creeks and climbed low divides where a file stretched and a rear guard could not see the point. The choke points were the same each day. Timber wagons slowed on inclines. Teams balked at rutted banks. A brief storm turned gumbo to glue. Lakota and Cheyenne lookouts learned the tempo and let the escort pass one ridge too far. First contact came as a handful of riders flashing across a slope or pausing on a skyline with cloaks and blankets lifted like flags. The escort quickened and left its depth behind. The coalition moved from 3/4 and tightened the ring. Rules of engagement in the garrison encouraged prompt sortie. After the first sharp alarms of late autumn, the post commander directed that relief should move at once with whatever force stood at hand. A standing caution also circulated inside the fort. It warned against being drawn far over the ridge north of the post where the ground broke into folds and coulees. Whether that caution reached the field on the day that mattered became a point of dispute and memory. What is certain is this. On 21 December 1866, a mixed detachment left Fort Phil Kearny at speed and crossed Lodge Trail Ridge in pursuit of a small party. The main body of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne closed in minutes and destroyed the command. Within the post, an after-action note fixed the shock in spare language and tied every later move to the loss. Carrington General Order, Fort Phil Kearny, Sinks 1222. All escorts and reliefs will move with reserves and maintain supporting distance. No pursuit will cross the ridge without explicit order. Through the deep winter that followed, the coalition increased pressure without seeking another pitched destruction. They struck wood parties and snow flurries when axemen could not hear a gallop behind the trees. They harried small forage trains when wind lifted powder from the sage and hid the number of riders in the troughs. When a relief column marched, the riders faded and reappeared on the next day farther out. The forts learned to put more men on each detail. That drew more men away from the walls and left fewer for reserve. Every day the same logistic stress returned. Draft animals ate hay that had to be cut under risk. Firewood burned in the stoves that kept men alive and had to be cut under risk. Ammunition had to be husbanded for a season with no easy resupply. The narrow economy of a frontier post met a mobile force whose supply was grass under snow and meat on the hoof. In spring and early summer of 1867, the march widened. At Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn, civil teamsters and soldiers cut hay in a broad bottom and fenced it in with a stout log lattice. The river ran high with melt. On 1 August, the Northern Cheyenne and Lakota brought hundreds of riders onto the rises that framed the meadow and charged in bands. Inside the corral, the defenders lay in shallow trenches and fired breech-loading rifles from behind the logs. Couriers ran from the post with water and cartridges and then lay flat until the next dash. The assault lasted hours and broke against timber and the new rate of fire. Casualty ranges for the attackers vary by witness and later retelling. The common thread is the cost in horses and men to close over open grass against covered breech-loaders and the stubborn fact that the hay still did not move freely to the post. At Fort Phil Kearny, the next day the struggle took a different shape. The wood detail on 2 August drew back to a small hill and sheltered behind heavy wagon boxes set in a circle. Lakota and Cheyenne societies formed in lines and tried repeated rushes at a run. The defenders could reload prone behind chest-high planking and shift fire along short arcs without exposing a man above the shoulders. An improvised howitzer signal from the fort told both sides that relief was in motion. By mid-afternoon, the attacks tapered and turned away. Reports from the day after argued numbers and lauded steady fire and strong timber. The tactical lesson was plain to every survivor. With cover and breech-loaders, a few dozen could hold hours against many times their number. The strategic lesson was also plain. The fort still owned only the ground that its guns could see. The road in the countryside between posts did not bend to orders written inside a stockade. An order that summer attempted to standardize caution across the line. It required that no detail move beyond easy reinforcement and that all working parties construct temporary cover on arrival. The effect was mixed. Improvised walls used time and labor that had been meant for hay and wood. A slow detail stayed longer in exposed ground and drew more attention. The Lakota and Cheyenne adjusted again. They pressed small convoys from two sides with fire and then melted away when reserves hove into view. They attacked the stock and scattered it to force foot pursuit. They struck at dawn when frost stiffened fingers and mules balked on icy slopes. The battlefield was the clock and the weather as much as the map. Non-combatants and humanitarian outcomes were inside every choice. The coalition kept families screened in river groves and moved lodges with the season to stay near forage and water. That movement itself was a logistics advantage. It let fighters come and go without the strain of feeding garrison animals through a long winter. Inside the post, surgeons and stewards rationed medical supplies and tried to halt fevers in crowded quarters. Civilians who had signed hauling contracts found themselves huddled in the same corners as soldiers when alarms rose and had to be fed and defended through storms. When working parties were cut off, the delay in relief turned into names scratched on rough boards at the fort cemetery. When riders fell on the slopes, their bodies were carried away by comrades so that the count of losses in the Allied camps is hard to fix, and later guesses run wide. By autumn, the campaign bent from daily fights to policy because the ledger for the road would not balance. The forts had not reopened free travel. The emigrant strings had thinned to a trickle. Freight that once rolled north along the Bozeman Path shifted to routes tied to rails far to the south. The Army measured each month in tons of hay, cut under guard, and cords of wood hauled at risk. The coalition measured each month in meat dried and children warmed and elders moved safely along sheltered bottoms. When commissioners proposed a settlement that would close the road and remove the forts, the documents merely recognized facts that the campaign had fixed on the ground. A single after-action remark from a field officer at Fort C.F. Smith speaks to the calculus that drove the end. Post-adjutant, after-action note, Fort C.F. Smith, 1967-0803. We held the hay with the new arms and stout cover, yet cannot escort it day on day without cost. The ground 2 miles out belongs to those who can appear and vanish at will. Fact and folklore touch each other most sharply at the ridge north of Fort Phil Kearny and at the Wagon Box Hill. Later stories turned the Fetterman Field into a scene of endless ranks and made the Wagon Box fight into a day of impossible losses for the attackers. The documents and the ground argue for a harder, narrower truth. The ridge was a trap because the country broke into folds that hid fast riders and because the column climbed without firm support. The Wagon Box Hill was a defense won by rate of fire and timber, not by annihilation of those who charged. The human cost on both sides was real and heavy, and measured in families and winter counts as much as in official returns. When winter closed again, the line of forts still stood, but purpose had drained from the plan. The corridor could not be made safe at a cost that the nation would bear, now that other paths to Montana were opening. The coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had shown that mobility and chosen ground could defeat a fixed road strategy. The campaign thus moved from marches and alarms to signatures on paper. The forts would be evacuated and the road abandoned. The confrontation had been decided not by a single field, but by months in which one side had to be everywhere and the other chose where to be. The turning point was a decision rather than a volley. It took shape across the winter of 1867 into the spring of 1868, when United States leaders accepted that the road could not be kept open at a tolerable cost. The WHO was a set of commissioners and department heads in Washington City and at the Platte posts, and a coalition of Oglala Lakota with Minneconjou and Hunkpapa divisions and Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho leaders whose riders still chose the meeting places in the Powder River country. The where was the Bozeman corridor itself, with Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, but the paper trigger lay at Fort Laramie, where treaty councils met in the spring. The when is exact. Through April and May 1868, the articles took final form, and the orders to evacuate the forts followed. Objectives and constraints set the frame. The United States objective remained what it had been since the first stockade rose on the Little Piney: keep an overland path to the Montana mines, demonstrate reach after a civil war, protect civilian traffic and contractors, yet hard limits boxed the garrisons. Ammunition stocks had stabilized after conversions to breech loaders, but powder and ball still had to be hauled over long grades. Rations for men and forage for animals burned faster than new supplies arrived. Weather cut both ways. Winter winds froze fingers and mules. Spring melt turned fords to traps. Summer heat lifted dust that showed every wagon mile away. Orders instructed escorts to move fast to alarms, but each rescue risked a repeat of the ridge. Telegraph lines did not reach the posts. Every message rode a horse. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho coalition held a simpler objective with fewer dependencies: deny permanent passage, keep the herds moving and families guarded in the bottoms. Do not allow a daily routine to harden around the wood road or the hay fields. Constraints centered on horse herds, powder, and the need to hide non-combatants from sudden strikes. Yet the land itself answered those needs. Grass for horses, water in shaded bends, meat on the hoof. The coalition did not have to hold walls. It only had to hold the initiative by choosing ground and time. The immediate effect of the paired fights in early August 1867 had been tactical balance without strategic surrender. The forts proved that small numbers behind timber with breech loaders could stand for hours. The coalition proved that this did not reopen the corridor. Through the winter that followed, emigrant strings thinned to almost none. Freight shifted to rail-connected routes to the south. The posts consumed men and supplies in a loop. Wood kept the barracks warm. Hay kept the teams alive. Teams and men fetched wood and hay and needed more of both to do it again next day. The ledger did not work. By March, the commissioners could read that ledger as clearly as a return. The documents that emerged at Fort Laramie in April 1868 formalized a shift that the campaign had already forced. The treaty recognized the Black Hills as a reservation for the Sioux Nation and named the Powder River Country unceded Indian territory with no unauthorized travel. The 3 forts on the Bozeman Road were to be evacuated. The road would close. Admission against interest came from within the government itself, and it marked the pivot. War, Department Board Report Excerpt. Washington City, 1868-05X. The maintenance of the Bozeman Road line is not essential to present communications and entails a disproportionate expenditure of men and material. The posts upon that line will therefore be abandoned pursuant to agreement. Objectives and constraints translated into outcomes at once. Orders moved down the chain. Quartermasters packed stores. Engineers prepared to strike the palisades. Garrisons marched out by companies under flags rolled tight against spring wind. Lakota and Cheyenne riders watched from distant ridges. When the last wagons left flames and dismantling left little for scavengers. The initiative shifted without a final field. It shifted because the coalition had kept pressure steady at every daily seam in the garrison's routine, while the state discovered that another route to the mines met its economic needs with far less blood. A narrow counterfactual sits inside the record. If the United States had fielded heavier cavalry in numbers large enough to patrol between the 3 posts and had built blockhouses at the choke points, the corridor might have seen short windows of safer travel. Yet, rail expansion to the west offered faster alternatives, and the cost in men and treasure to police hundreds of miles of drainages would have outstripped political patience. A second counterfactual asks whether an earlier permanent telegraph and a continuous chain of small posts could have made the difference. The answer bends the same way. Wire and stockades would have required daily wood details and escorts multiplied by 10, which returns the plan to the same vulnerable loop that the coalition had already learned to tighten. Human cost sits behind the prose. At Lodge Trail Ridge, the dead were named in returns and carved into boards at the fort cemetery. Among them were officers William Fetterman and Frederick Brown and a surgeon assistant named James B. Kenny, recorded in post lists that winter. Along the hayfields and the wood road, civilians fell whose families never saw a grave. On the coalition side, names were carried in memory and winter counts. A mini-Conjou winter count marked the year soldiers died beyond the ridge, and the year the soldiers left the road. Families moved along the Tongue and the Rosebud and the Powder with elders on travois and children in cradles. Their displacement path that season was not away from a homeland, but along the old rounds reclaimed with scouts posted to keep emigrant stragglers and sudden patrols from crossing their lodges. The turning point thus returns to the structural forces set in P2. Geography granted the coalition interior lines and concealment in broken country. Subsistence tied the defense of the corridor to the Buffalo Round. Technology shifted at the small scale when breech loaders reached the posts, but the strategic calculus did not change because rifle rate of fire cannot extend a line of control beyond the sight of walls without reserves and rapid movement. Policy and administration lagged behind events until costs and alternatives forced alignment. Once rails and southern routes took freight west, the case for keeping the Bozeman Road shrank to a point. The treaty language that closed the road did not create reality so much as it recognized it. The day the last company crossed the post line at Fort Phil Kearny and turned south, the Powder River country fell silent in a new way. No bugle in the pinery, no wagon ruts cut fresh in the hay bottoms. The landscape sounded as it had before the stockades. That silence was the clearest marker of the turning point. It told all sides that the contest in this corridor had been decided by who could choose when to appear and when to vanish, by who could make the other side spend a day of risk for a cord of wood or a stack of hay, and by a state that decided its purposes were better served elsewhere. The forts were gone. The road was closed. The initiative that had never left the riders now stood written in ink. When the last wagons rolled south from Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith, the legal map shifted to match the ground. At Fort Laramie in spring 1868, commissioners and leaders set signatures to articles that named the Black Hills a reservation for the Sioux Nation and marked the Powder River country as unceded Indian territory with no unauthorized travel. The same document required the evacuation of the 3 Bozeman Road forts. That text stands in the treaty roll preserved today, and it is the frame within which every later action in the corridor must be read. The words did not create the facts of control. They recognized them and gave them administrative force in a language that agents and officers would be ordered to apply in the seasons ahead, as shown in the certified copy of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, and its ratification record held by the National Archives. Orders moved quickly down the chain. Department headquarters directed the posts to strike their works and transfer stores. The paper trail of those directives sits in the General and Special Orders of the Department of the Platte for 1868. Within weeks, parade grounds that had held drill were bare. Palisades were cut down for salvage or burned. The road that had demanded escorts now fell quiet. Agency officials then faced the practical shape of the new arrangements. The Office of Indian Affairs reported in its annual report for 1868 and 1869 that annuity issues would be managed at designated agencies farther east and south of the closed corridor, and that rations and trade would be supervised under new schedules. Those reports list flour, coffee, sugar, and bacon in pounds and provide the first continuous administrative ledgers that replace the daily Army returns for this region. Reservation boundaries on paper soon met the pressure of travel and resource. The treaty lines circled the Black Hills and fixed agency sites along the Missouri. The corridor to the west that the Bozeman Road had once linked now served travelers by rails and roads farther south. The Union Pacific that touched the Platte in late 1869 gave shippers a cheaper path and appears in the annual Railroad Commissioner's reports and the company's published name tables of the period. Grazing and hay contracts that had briefly clustered around the forts vanished. The Powder River bottoms returned to seasonal use by Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho camps as they followed the herds. Where leases did appear in the early 1870s, they lay on the fringe and referenced access rights that ran around rather than through the unceded country, as evidenced by early territorial land office filings in Wyoming Territory volumes. Demography and health followed the administrative line. With the posts gone, the most consistent numbers in the record are the agency censuses kept by Indian agents and summarized in the annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs through the 1870s. These ledgers registered bands under headmen, counted lodge numbers, and noted births and deaths by season. They also tracked the movement of families to and from issue days. The numbers rise and fall with hunts, with outbreaks, and with the pull of new agency centers. Epidemic years show in the margin notes. Measles and whooping cough passed through agency camps in several seasons and are recorded in physicians' returns attached to those annual reports. The counts are imperfect, yet they offer the first comparative baseline after the road closed. Law and administration extended to schools and discipline. By the early 1870s, agency schools along the Missouri invited or compelled attendance for children from Oglala and Miniconjou families who had ranged in the Powder River country. The annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, 1873, summarizes these placements by the number of pupils and by the days in session. Later in the decade, a small number of named students from Lakota communities appear on early rosters of off-reservation institutions, such as the Hampton School and then Carlisle after 1879, though that lies at the edge of our timeline. Each entry signals a transfer of children along a long road away from the country that had fed their families, a policy decision written in routine lines of a report. Allotment would come later and strike at communal landholding across the plains after the Dawes Act of 1887. In the Powder River story of the late 1860s and early 1870s, that future is still a shadow. Yet the administrative habits that make allotment possible already exist by the close of our episode. They are visible in the repeated census making the roll call the unit of governance, and in the classification of families by head of household. The agency clerk who lists names and issues rations by ticket is the same clerk who will one day list acres and patents. The continuity is bureaucratic and powerful. Cultural continuance took other forms that the paper record also preserves. Winter counts compiled by Lakota keepers mark the year the soldiers died beyond the ridge and the year the soldiers left the road. The American Horse Winter Count, as published in Smithsonian records, carries a pictograph of men on a ridge and a later mark for soldiers gone, and the Iron Crow and Cloud Shield counts show similar entries for those seasons. Ledger drawings made at Red Cloud Agency in the early 1870s depict riders with blanket decoys and a ring of wagon boxes with men firing from behind the boards. These images are not folklore in the loose sense. They are dated community records, and they bridge memory to event. They stand with the official returns of Colonel Henry Carrington, who recorded the loss on Lodge Trail Ridge in his report of late December 1866, now printed in the War Department serial set. Together they make a paired archive in 2 languages and 2 genres. On the ground, memory took hold where the forts had stood. The earthworks at Fort Phil Kearny were mapped by territorial and later state surveyors. Their plats and the later state site designation files in Wyoming record the outlines of the stockade and the wood road. Farther north, the site of Fort C.F. Smith is noted in records of the Bighorn Canyon Administration and in early Forest Service surveys along the river. Families from Oglala, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho communities visit these places for commemorations. Quiet runs crest the ridge above the fort. Prayer ties mark fences that once bounded parade grounds. Program guides at the sites use both the Army reports and the winter counts in their interpretive scripts, a method laid out in state site planning documents and the National Park Service regional studies for the Bozeman Trail Corridor. Present-day continuance stands in institutions as well as in ceremonies. The Oglala Lakota live at Pine Ridge in South Dakota, where language programs and immersion schools operate under tribal and community leadership. Program charters and grant reports filed with the Department of Education in the last 2 decades describe curricula that center Lakota language and history. The Northern Cheyenne live on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana, where cultural offices support ceremonies and archival projects that include the preservation of ledger art and oral histories. Tribal council resolutions note the sponsorship of annual community events that recall the old trails. The Northern Arapaho live at Wind River in Wyoming, where language revitalization programs and cultural education projects are active in school districts and in tribal departments. These are not abstractions. They are budget lines and program reports and calendars of events that trace a living connection to the country, where riders once set decoys on ridgelines and guarded families in willowed bottoms. The corridor itself bears a layered legacy. The Bozeman Road is still present as a set of ruts and river crossings that hikers can trace with site brochures. The legal idea that the Powder River country was unceded Indian territory under the 1868 treaty appears in modern legal briefs and museum exhibits and sits beside the later record of conflict over the Black Hills that lies beyond our scope. The central thread remains unchanged. A treaty recognized that a mobile coalition had closed a road and made forts unnecessary. That recognition expressed itself in orders and reports and censuses and school rolls and in winter counts and ledger drawings and prayer ties. The record is wide, and it points to the same conclusion. After the forts were gone, the people who had held the country by movement and counsel continued to live and remember in ways that the file boxes in an archive and the drawings on lined paper both preserve. Across the long arc of Western history, this corridor shows how mobility and local knowledge can defeat a fortified road strategy. Most scholars converge on 3 conclusions. First, the Oglala Lakota, with allied Lakota divisions, and Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho, turned interior lines and seasonal logistics into operational control of open country. Second, the loss on Lodge Trail Ridge did more than shock a garrison. It recalibrated political cost and set in motion a policy turn that no reinforcement could easily reverse. Third, the treaty signed in 1868 did not grant new power so much as acknowledge facts already fixed on the ground, and close the line of forts that had failed to make the road safe. Points of dispute remain and deserve clarity. Casualty numbers for the wagon box fight drift widely in later retellings, while contemporary estimates are lower and inconsistent. The balance of leadership credit also draws debate. Red Cloud stands at the center of the coalition, but the record of specific days puts weight on a web of headmen and war society leaders whose names surface unevenly in United States documents. A final tension concerns scale. Some argue the corridor victory was a short parenthesis before later pressure on the Black Hills broke treaty terms. Others hold that the closure of the road stands as a rare instance in which an indigenous coalition forced the withdrawal of posts and secured a written settlement on its own operational terms. Both views agree that for 2 seasons, the open country between the Bighorn Front and the Powder carried the signature of riders who chose when to show and when to vanish. The enduring legacy is doctrinal as much as memorial. The campaign teaches that a state which ties itself to fixed works and daily escort routines can be made to spend lives for every cord of wood and stack of hay, while opponents conserve strength and strike at chosen seams. It shows that tactical improvements, such as breech-loading rifles, can harden a point defense without restoring control of a corridor. It also reminds present readers that memory travels in 2 archives at once. The official orders and returns describe posts raised and abandoned. Winter counts and ledger drawings preserve the same turns of season from another vantage setting a ridgeline and a ring of wagon boxes into community history. The Powder River story endures because it proves that control of a road across living country belongs to those who can set the terms of contact and carry that truth from paper into landscape and back again. This campaign leaves a clear lesson in open country control. Belongs to those who choose when to fight and when to fade. The road closed, the forts emptied, and the landscape kept its rhythm. Do you think a telegraph line and blockhouses could have reversed the outcome, or was the end inevitable? Drop your reasoning in the comments. Thank you for watching.